So, okay, so we're going to start with the kind of program for today, which is to practice like the Buddha. What do you think about that idea? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Is it a scary idea? Is it reaching too high? Reaching too high, far away? Yeah. Well, this is one of those interesting things that I find about the Buddha, because I think one of the mistakes that we often do in Buddhism is that we misunderstand the Buddha, who the Buddha is, what is. A lot of suttas where the Buddha talks about his own practice. He says, this is what I did. Yeah, I had these defilements. This is how I overcame these defilements. This is how I sorted out my views. There's lots of suttas like that. Now, why are there so many suttas where the Buddha talks about his own practice before his awakening? And the answer, of course, is very simple. The reason is because he wants us to inspire us to do the same thing, right? That's the purpose. But to be able to do that, to be able to really be inspired by the practice of the Buddha to be, this is not the Buddha yet, the Buddha to be, we have to understand that the Buddha is human pretty much in exactly the same way that we are. If we understand the Buddha in the wrong way, if we think of the Buddha as something more than human, it actually, this whole idea of the Buddha inspiring us in this way doesn't work anymore, because then his practice is one thing, our practice is going to have to be different, because we are different from the Buddha, or the Buddha to be, before his awakening. Of course, after his awakening, he is different, right? I mean, of course, that's not, you can't really compare quite after the awakening experience, because it changes your psychology in a fundamental way. But prior to the awakening, the Buddha is human, just like we are. Same problems, same things to overcome, same kind of things. And you'll be surprised. The more I look at the suttas, it's weird. When you come to the suttas, you have all these preconceived ideas about what to read, and you don't see 90% of what is there when you start reading the suttas. You can't see it because you are conditioned by perceptions and views and all kind of things that actually block you from being able to see what is going on. But then after a while, you start to look again and say, wait a minute, there's something very interesting here. And then you start to see how the Buddha again and again talks about himself in a way that actually makes him relatable as an ordinary human being. And this is very fascinating. So what the idea of this short little course, I just did a very similar kind of course in KL just before I came here. That was a bit longer, so I'm going to have to kind of cram more things into a short period of time. So I'm going to talk very fast during this retreat so I can really get things going. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to talk slowly because it's good. It's not the amount of things that you say. It is the ability to understand what is being said that matters, not the quantity of stuff. And we're too kind of caught up with quantity, I think, in this world, when quality is actually what really matters. So the idea here is basically to ask ourselves, how can we follow the Noble Eightfold Path based on what the Buddha to be talks, what Buddha says about his own practice? So we're going to look at the idea of the Noble Eightfold Path from the viewpoint of the Buddha and his practice. And one of the kind of things that people, I think we almost always underestimate in this practice, and that is the importance of right view. Right view is the foundation of the Noble Eightfold Path. It is the beginning of everything else. Without that right view, Noble Eightfold Path doesn't even start. There is no right intention, no right purpose, no right aim, no right goal. Everything is just a big blur. You know what it's like to be blurred, right? Oh, it's just blur. So everything is blurred, and you kind of have no idea what really you have to do or practice or anything like that. So right views are so important. And I think this is one of the biggest weaknesses for many people. We practice, we kind of do many things that are right. I know a lot of people here at the Buddhist Fellowship are really good people, and you're really practicing to the best of your ability, many of you, and that's wonderful. And you practice the virtues, you practice the kindnesses, you do some bit of metta meditation, you kind of do some peaceful meditation, some insight maybe. And sometimes you do all of these things and still you feel maybe not making as much progress as you would like to do. Is anyone here who has made more progress than they would like to do, like to have? That's very hard to imagine, right? There is no such thing as more progress than you want. Usually people make less progress than they want. And that's usually the way these things are. So, and the reason for that is very often has to do with this idea of view at the beginning of the path. Because our view is slightly wrong, it blocks us from moving forward. So view is something that I'm going to talk quite a bit about now, and this is a very important part of how the Buddha, how he gets started on the practice, why he leaves the household life, why he becomes a monastic, his attitude to the world, and all of these kind of things. I'm going to look at that in quite a bit of detail. So see if we can kind of approximate our own views to the way the Buddha talks about things. And the idea of view is very much related to a number of factors on the Buddhist path. Yeah, we often talk about wisdom in Buddhism, and view and wisdom are very closely related to each other. If you're wise, you have more right view. If you have more right view, you are wise because of that. Right view is also connected to the idea of faith or confidence, saddha, on the Buddhist path. Yeah, confidence. The more confidence you have in the Buddha, the more you read the sutras and you have confidence, the more right view you have, because you cannot take that on board. And the more right view you have, well, in turn, the more confidence you have, because it means that your view is aligned with how the Buddha teaches things. Perception is another important factor that aligns with view, because the way we view the world is often also how we perceive the world. So our perceptions relate to our views, and our views relate to our perceptions. So one of the important ways of correcting our views is to develop our perceptions in certain ways. And as you read the sutras, you realize that actually a very large part of the Buddhist way of practice is actually the development of perception. Perception is called sanya in Pali, and there's a large number of developments of perceptions found in the sutras. Especially things like the anicca sanya, the perception of impermanence, is a very important one. Anatta sanya, perception of non-self. These are things that kind of recur again and again in the sutras. So this is kind of a little bit of background for you. So we're going to look at now the Buddha to be rather, and we're going to start off by looking at the things that motivated him to go forth and become a monastic. And we're going to measure the effect of these teachings by seeing how many of you line up to go forth after we see after this thing's done. If it really works, then of course everyone is going to want to go forth afterwards. Okay, so we'll see. It never really. It's unfortunate, but I always think that's going to, everyone is going to line up. But it usually doesn't happen like that. That's very, very disappointing to me when that kind of doesn't work. So, but anyway, it's a conditioning process, So hopefully it will at least have some benefit. So let's go to the first sutta over here. Okay, we got it up. Okay, so let me just backtrack a little bit. Here we have the very famous, well-known sutta, which is one of the main suttas where the Buddha talks about his own life before his awakening. And this sutta is called the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the Noble Search. I'm going to have some of the very kind tea that has been offered to me. Actually, the tea is not kind. The person who offered it is kind. I should make this clear. So this is a very, very well-known sutta because it talks about the Buddha, how he started out from lay life until his awakening, and then the process that happened after his awakening. And here you have this idea of the noble search, right? The Buddha says that mendicants, there are these two searches, the noble search and the ignoble search. What is the ignoble search? Oh, I can barely see anything. What is the ignoble search? This has this idea of the noble search and the ignoble search. And this word noble is a word that you see a lot in the sutras. And it's a very beautiful word. There's something about nobility. It kind of lifts you up and makes you kind of a better person. A noble person. And a noble person in Buddhism is someone who is really kind, someone who has really good qualities of the heart, someone who has wisdom. That's a noble person in Buddhism. There's something very beautiful about this word noble, to be a noble person, upright. And then, of course, then there's the ignoble person who is a bit of a kind of not so inspiring. Yeah. And so the noble search, is a search where you are aspiring for something high. You're aspiring for good qualities of the mind. You're aspiring to become more wise. This is the noble search. You're aspiring for happiness in yourself and the people around you. You're aspiring to all of these things that make life meaningful. In the end of the day, it comes down to meaning. If you have a meaningful life and you're searching for the meaning of life, that is really the noble search. The ignoble search is the search for more dukkha. If you're searching for dukkha, you're doing the ignoble search. And the vast majority of people in the world, they think they are searching for happiness. In fact, they are searching for suffering here. This is the problem here. So are you searching for happiness or are you searching for suffering here? And this is kind of interesting, right? Because obviously our inclination of our heart is always to search for happiness. But because we don't understand happiness and suffering, how can we possibly search for happiness if we don't even understand the difference? This is one of the foundational ideas of right view, is the ability to distinguish happiness and suffering in the right way. And we can't do that. Why? Because our views are distorted, our perceptions are distorted. We look at the world upside down. It's that beautiful saying that what the noble people take to be happiness, ordinary people take to be suffering. What the noble people take to be suffering, ordinary people take to be happiness. So in other words, we haven't got a clue what we're doing here. I was recently in the United States, in the US, and I was traveling around, and it's always interesting to go to a new place. I never really taught in the US before. I traveled over the entire continent, and it was, the bottom line is that people are the same everywhere. That's really the bottom line. But there is kind of variations to the theme, right? So whenever you go to a new culture, there are slightly differences. And one of the places this was in Minneapolis, where all the kind of Norwegian migrants went, right? So I was kind of coming almost to home turf there because I was born in Norway myself. And one of the things they asked me to talk about there, and I like to talk to people's questions and ideas and themes, was the idea of constitutional freedoms versus Buddhist freedoms. And the American constitutional freedoms is the idea that you have a right to carry a gun. That's I'm not sure if that's a freedom, but anyway, that's what they consider it over there. And the kind of the right to freedom of speech and these kind of things. It's kind of called constitutional freedoms versus Buddhist freedoms. And they are based on the kind of the idea of the American Constitution. And the American Constitution, it starts off with something like, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is kind of one of these basic things in the American Constitution. And the reason I remember that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is because when I grew up, I was living in the UK, there was a commercial for Wrangler jeans. And the commercial for Wrangler jeans was life, liberty, and the what was it? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of Wrangler jeans. No, but something like that. Life, liberty, and Wrangler jeans. I think it was. So Wrangler jeans was the pursuit of happiness. That was kind of the commercials. After that, I never forgot about the kind of this preamble to the American Constitution. But as I pointed out to the crowd, is that the problem with this whole idea, yes, you have a liberty, you have the right to pursue happiness, but if you don't know what happiness is, you have a problem. So I said to them, actually what you should do, you should take a few paragraphs from the Buddhist Suttas, put that in, whack that into the American Constitution, then you're going to be in business. Something about understanding real happiness. And then, of course, they laugh because they realize that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So, but that is really what we need in the world, because we don't understand where happiness is to be found. We are deluded about this. So this is the problem with the noble search, is that it is noble precisely because it is difficult to uncover and very difficult to know where to go. So let's start out with the ignoble search. In this way, we should be able to gradually move on towards the noble search. What is the ignoble search? It's someone who is themselves liable to reborn seeks what is also liable to be reborn. Themselves liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, become corrupted, the seeker is also liable to these things. This is the ignoble search. You are searching for, you already have a problem in your life. The problem is that you're going to go old. The problem is that you're going to sorrow. The problem is that you get corrupted. And then you seek for other things that have exactly the same problem. You're compounding a problem that you already have, making it worse by kind of looking for the same kind of things. This is the ignoble search, because you're not coming out of suffering. In fact, you're making suffering worse because you're looking for the wrong thing. Kind of makes sense, right? So now let's look at these things in turn a little bit, just to see what they really are about. What should be described as liable to be reborn? Partners and children, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle are liable to be reborn. So, how many people know what a bondservant is? Anyone heard the word bondservant before? Like a slave, right? It means like a slave, really, but it's not quite a slave, but it's kind of similar to a slave. And I told my friend Ajahn Sujato, don't use the word bondservant. No one knows what that is. But he insisted on using the word bondservant, so there it is. So because the idea is it's not really a slave. A slave is kind of worse. Bondservant is not as bad. So that's why I said he must have bondservant in there. And I said, all right, then it's up to you. Do as you see fit. So here we have the idea of rebirth, right? Straight away from the beginning. And you will see the word for birth. See, I have the Pali here, so I'm going to teach you Pali as we go along. So here we have the word jati. And the word jati is translated as rebirth or reborn. Usually it is translated as birth. And I think I just want to make the point that I think Bhante Sujato is right in translating it as a rebirth, and the reason is that in ancient India, birth and rebirth were the same thing. So when you heard the word jati, you would think of it meaning birth, but you would also think of it as meaning rebirth, because every instance of birth was also an instance of rebirth. The two were always connected. But when we hear the word birth, we never think of rebirth, right? That's absolutely not part of what we're thinking here. But if we think of rebirth, then birth is included within rebirth. So in other words, for us, we have to translate the other way around to be able to get the same idea. So the point of translating the sutras is to convey the same information to the audience. And that is the way to do this here. You convey the same information by translating it as rebirth or reborn. So I agree with this, even though I prefer to be critical, because it's more fun to be critical. In this case, I have to agree here. I'm just messing around. Please excuse me for being such a naughty monk. I have been taught by Ajahn Brahmali. He is also a naughty monk. So this is the school. This is the school I've been practiced in. The Brahmavamsa school of Buddhism, the Mahayana. So we have all of these things get reborn, right? It's kind of obvious, all the people in our life, all the animals in our life, get reborn. Why are all of these animals mentioned here? You may wonder why they're mentioned, and one of the reasons why they're mentioned is because these were very important things in ancient India. Right here in Singapore, it's not so important. Goats and sheep, I mean, you never see them. It's not like as if your apartment is full of goats and sheep, right? It's not kind of something important. But in ancient India, this was a sign of wealth. The more animals you had, the more wealth you had. They had large pieces of land. They didn't have apartment blocks like you have here in Singapore. So this was a sign of wealth. It was a very important part of their life, and they lived off these things. So for them it was significant. That's why it is mentioned in this way here. So all of these things are subject to being rebirth. So what is the issue here? Why does the Buddha bring this up? Or the Buddha the Buddha I suppose, because it's looking back. So why is he bringing up rebirth? Usually when we think about the reasons why the Buddha went forth, usually they talk about old age, illness and death, right? This is kind of the standard devadutas. You know the expression devaduta? Yeah, these are the divine messengers. Deva is the divine, yeah. Duta is like a messenger. So these are the divine messengers. They cannot tell you, hold on, yeah, there's a problem here. It's like, there's a nice story about the Devaduta. It's kind of, where is that found? I think it's the, is it the Majjhima 84, the Makadeva Sutta, something like that. There's a nice story about the Devadutas. There's this king, and sometimes you find kings who are really cool kings. Sometimes kings are really not so cool, but other times they're quite cool. And this particular king, he says to his barber, he says, well, barber, when you see the first gray hair on my head, yeah, I want you to let me know. And so the years go by, and these kings in those days, they lived for 84,000 years or something like that, some enormous length of time. And then after 20,000 years, because the life was so long, the barber said, oh, sir, I see a gray hair on your head. And the king says, well, pull it out and show it to me. So takes tweezers or whatever they used in those days, I'm not sure what they used. Takes tweezers, pulls out the gray hair and shows it to the king. And he said, all right, gray hair, time to go forth. Isn't that nice? That's really so cool. And that's really kind of, because that shows you the idea that Devaduta has arrived, that the divine messenger is there. It's a reminder of the reality of life, a reminder of straightening out your perceptions. And then he actually goes forth and he hands over the kingdom to his sons. Yeah, daughters, they didn't get kingdoms in those days, so they handed over to the sons. And then he went forth and became a monastic. And that's really, really kind of powerful. And so that is usually what we also find with the Buddha. He remembers old age, remembers illness and death. These are the things that normally make him go forth. But here we have rebirth, first of all. So why is that? This is actually quite rare in the suttas to have rebirth first like this. So what is going on? And there's a number of things going on, but I think one of the main things that is going on is that even death, old age and illness, they are really only a problem in the context of rebirth. Yeah? So very often in the sutras, you see the sequence is just like, if it goes to the First Noble Truth, for example, the First Noble Truth is similar. It starts off with jati, with rebirth. Then you have old age, sickness, and death. And this is a theme throughout the sutras, that particular sequence. Because what it really means is that it's not death as such which is the problem. It is re-death that is the problem. Have you heard the expression re-death before? Okay, so you have to kind of go in really kind of refined circles to hear these kind of words, like re-death. Re-death, re-old age, re-sickness, that is the issue. If these things only happened once, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's in the context of rebirth that this is really a problem, because it goes on and on and on. And every lifetime, every time you can come into this world, you attach to things, you hold on, you crave, you desire, you build up all of these things. And then death comes and takes it all away from you. And that is a problem, right? Every time it ends in tears. Every time it ends in a problem. The conclusion of every life is problematic, because in the meantime you grasp, you hold on, you attach to things that are not really attachable to her. Yeah, so this is when this carries on like this, that is where the issue arises. And that is why rebirth here starts at the beginning, because this gives you this kind of panoramic view of the reality of life and why it is so problematic and why it causes problems in the way we're talking about here. So this is I think a very important point, that it's actually re-death that is the problem, not death as such. And maybe we should use this kind of terminology more often. Do you like the idea of re-death? Is it a good idea? Yeah, we should maybe we should. Anyway. So that is the first point. But the other interesting point right here. Okay. Wow. I'm just getting worried, because there are so much things that we need to talk about, and already we're kind of getting stuck on the first one here. But that's okay. Even if we talk about this all the way for the next 2 days, it's all right actually. So, but the other thing which is fascinating here, and this is the idea that this is the Buddha to be here, yeah, and he's already assuming the idea of rebirth. Yeah, I mean, we are used to thinking of the Buddha or the Buddha to be as someone who investigates everything. Yeah. But here, before his awakening, before his insight into these things, he's already assuming rebirth. So what is it? Is the Buddha just a product of his society and it takes on the ideas that are already there? Or is he investigating for himself? Yeah, and this is kind of a very interesting point, because this seems to go against how we often taught Buddha. The Buddha investigates everything, he knows, yeah, he doesn't take things on board. But this seems to be saying the opposite. And this kind of buys into this idea. You may have heard of the idea of secular Buddhism. And secular Buddhism is the idea that we throw out all the superstition and we just kind of are left with the kind of the rational part of the Buddhist teachings. Yeah, the superstition we throw out, and of course, very often in the modern day, the idea of superstition is things like rebirth is considered superstitious, so you chuck it out, and of course, by chucking it out, you chuck out the whole of Buddhism, basically. Goodbye Buddhism, but that's kind of that's a different thing altogether. People don't really get that this is actually so fundamental. There is no Buddhism without rebirth. But anyway, so this is then important, because this kind of gives fuel to that argument. Yeah, look, the Buddha is just assuming rebirth. Yeah, and so what is it? Is the Buddha investigating, or is he assuming? Yeah, and I think it's very important to understand that when you grow up in any kind of culture, you are going to be conditioned by that culture, regardless. And this is true of us, every one of us here. We are conditioned by the modern world, by, you are conditioned by Singaporean culture. I'm conditioned by, I don't know, Norwegian, Australian, a bit of here, a bit of there. These days people are more international, not really sure what we are anymore. We're kind of some conglomeration of a vast number of different things. But whatever it is, we are conditioned. That's kind of the main point. And so it is for the Buddha to be. He is an ordinary human being. He has no choice but to be conditioned. He will speak that language. He will like Indian food, probably, right? And he will wear Indian dress and all of these things, because it's part of that culture. And so the mainstream culture at the time of the Buddha was obviously a culture that actually believed in rebirth. That's kind of obvious. Not everyone believed in rebirth. There are examples in the sutras of philosophers and ascetics who actually rejected the idea of rebirth, which is interesting. Yeah, it existed at the time already. But that was still the mainstream idea. So the Buddha would have probably assumed that there was such a thing as rebirth. But the assumption that there is rebirth does not mean that he didn't also recognize that he didn't know this. Yeah, he probably recognized that, well, even though I assume this, I don't know. And so on the night of his awakening, went through the 3 watches, he would then have investigated this, and he would have actually discovered for himself, actually there is such a thing as rebirth. So both are true. Yeah, both are true. The Buddha was, on the one hand, conditioned by the ideas in ancient India, and he would have thought in accordance with those ideas, and he would also have ascertained for himself whether these ideas were true. And that gives a bit more nuance to the idea how we normally think about the Buddha. Yeah, he's not one-sided. He's a complex person, and he's a person much like us, conditioned by the environment around him. In fact, I think that many of the things that were present in ancient India are necessary for a Buddha to arise. It was fascinating. Yesterday I was in KL, and one of the questions that came up was a question of, well, how come every Buddha is born in India? How is that possible, right? Previous eon, there was a different planet, there was a different solar system, different universe. How can we talk about India? It doesn't make any sense if it's a different universe, right? And I think, I was arguing, well, wherever the Buddha is born, that country, they just call it India. Right? So that's kind of the answer. But I think the point is rather that it requires a certain culture for a Buddha to be able to rise in a place. And that culture will have many similarities to the Indian culture, because unless those things are there, it is impossible to become a Buddha in that place. What are those things? Well, one of them, I think, is precisely the belief in rebirth. Yeah, this idea has to be there so that your mind is already inclining in the right direction. Because only with the idea of rebirth does the idea of suffering really arise properly in your mind. So this is one of those conditions I think may be necessary for a Buddha to arise. What other conditions do you think might be necessary for a Buddha to arise? Well, one of them is that there is a certain respect for people who go forth, into the ascetic lives. Like when you go into the village for alms, people give you food instead of abuse. Yeah, if all they give you is abuse because they think, you get yourself a job, that kind of thing, which sometimes actually it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it may happen. You need to have a society where ascetics are respected, where you can live as an ascetic. And India had that in great amount. There was a large samana tradition in India before the Buddha, and people practiced in the right way. And so that was present in that. In Singapore, you have a little bit of that perhaps, but nowhere near what they have in India. In Australia, it hardly exists, right? And so it would be very, very difficult to be a Buddha in a place like Australia. And so this is important, right? So these things, and I think another thing that is really important for a Buddha to arise is that not only is there a samana culture, but there is a samana culture where there is already a large degree of spiritual development within that culture. So people are already attaining samadhi. They've already gone a long, long way on the path. They still have a little bit left. They haven't gone all the way to awakening, but they have achieved maybe jhana states. They have achieved samadhi states, which makes the gap to enlightenment quite small. Rather than having this enormous gap, it's quite small. So the last step that you have to traverse is not so enormous. So these are some of the things, and that's why I think maybe it is called India, because these characteristics have to be present that is similar to Indian culture, so they just call it India. What do you think? Is that kind of reasonable idea? I know it's just my random ideas, so don't take them too seriously, but that's kind of what I think, because it's kind of weird that every Buddha is born in India. So this is the idea of rebirth, right? Rebirth is a real problem. And because rebirth is a real problem, if you search for other things that have the same problem, well, you're just compounding your own problem that you have already. And you just adding dukkha to dukkha, and that's why it is called an ignoble search. Okay, let's move on to this is the first one. And what should be described as liable to grow old? Partners and children, male and female, slaves, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle are liable to grow old. Everyone grows old, not just you, but everyone around you grows older. And this is a problem, because usually the person we get married to, the partner, they are young, and we don't really consider fully that they're going to grow old, right? And they're going to die down the track, and your children are going to grow old. That's really hard to see. You become old, and then your children become old as well. That's really difficult to deal with. And even your elephants become old. They can't pull the same load that they used to be able to pull when they were young, and they just need to be looked after. And so I'm going to talk more about this on Sunday, because on Sunday we're going to talk about the idea of insight. And I'm going to use these things as examples of how to develop insight on Sunday. I'm not going to talk too much about it now, because then I have nothing to talk about on Sunday. So you have to be smart here. You have to kind of plan this out so that it kind of there's a sequence here. But basically the idea is to understand the nature of what we are. And when you understand the nature of what you are, you withdraw some of the interest in that world, and you start to go onto the spiritual path instead. All of these things tend to move you onto the spiritual path if you look at them in the right way. This is kind of the whole point of this. This is why this is called right view. It kind of you move away from this, and so because that is helpful for empowering the spiritual path, it is important to develop this perception of old age. To remember that, to remind you. Our inclination is to forget about it. Our inclination is not to think about these things. This is the perception that we have developed over lifetimes. We don't want to know about the things that are dukkha. We want to pretend that things are sukha, even though they are dukkha. That is the problem of vested interest in that world. Okay, let's carry on. Oh, I forgot about this part here. I'm just going too fast. Okay, so it then says these attachments are liable to be reborn. Someone who is tied, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to being reborn, seeks what is also liable to be reborn. Tied, infatuated means like being in love with. So that's why we have talking about partners and children here. You're tied to it, you are in love with it, and you are attached to it. And that very idea of being attached, craving, wanting things, that is what seeking means. Because when you crave, when you're attached, you are seeking something in that world. You have a vested interest in that world, and you want an outcome which actually is impossible to get in that world. That is the issue. You want an outcome, but the reality is different. Same thing with old age. You want a particular outcome, but you're not going to get it. These attachments are liable to grow old. You notice here how these people and animals are called attachments, right? The Pali word is upada or upada. Yo is a plural ending. They're called upadas, and these are attachments or things we own in that world, the possessions, etc. And everything in the world is an upada. Even your own 5 khandhas are an upada because you are attached to those 5 khandhas. Maybe, I don't know, unless we have some very enlightened people here, but you would normally be attached to those 5 khandhas. Someone who is tied, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to grow old, seeks what is also liable to grow older. What should be described as liable to fall sick? And you get no prizes for guessing what the answer is. Partners and children, male and female bond servants, not slaves, mind you, but bond servants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle are liable to fall sick. And the more we kind of recognize that sickness is not an aberration, but sickness is part and parcel of what it means to be a living being, a human or animal or whatever, the more you recognize that, the more clarity you have about the nature of the human body, what it actually means to have this body. And that clarity clears up your mind, and it makes you, again, gives you a tendency to want to practice the spiritual path because you understand the limitations of the worldly life. This is, again, the purpose of this, to drive you towards the spiritual path. These attachments are liable to fall sick. Someone who is tied, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to falling sick, seeks what is also liable to fall sick. And what should be described as liable to die? Partners and children, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle are liable to die. How much do you want to attach to things that are liable to die? It's kind of scary, isn't it, how we voluntarily attach to so many things in the world, and we should actually know that the moment you attach, you're asking for suffering here. This is the reality of things, because the moment you're attached, you know that separation will have to come, and we are asking for suffering all the time. This is kind of the problem with our situation, what our life is like. These attachments are liable to die. Someone who is tied, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to die, seeks what is also liable to die. This is the right view of the Buddha to be, seeing these things in a deep way. And what I have looked at now, these are the 3 main reflections that the Buddha makes in the suttas, the Buddha to be makes: sickness, old age, and death. So these are very powerful things. remember, these are the reflections that made the Buddha go forth. There's a nice sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya 3, it's called the Sukumala Sutta, which means that someone who was brought up in a kind of really plush and comfortable circumstances, and the Buddha was brought up in a very plush way for that time. And this is then what made him go forth and realize the downside of that ordinary life. Yeah, so this is it. This is the power of these reflections. And they seem so ordinary, right? We all know about old age, sickness, and death, right? No, we don't. That's the problem. We think we do, but actually we don't. And this is kind of what is so interesting about this. Our idea of these things is very superficial. We know it, but we don't know it. We don't know it deep enough. And this is what is the idea here behind the, contemplating these things and establishing this right view, seeing existence more clearly, understanding what this actually entails in the larger picture of things. And this idea that we are holding on to things in the world and we grasp onto stuff that will lead to suffering down the track, this is the problem. So this is kind of the issue here. So how do we deal with that? And some of you, you may think, well, I have no choice. I have to have a family. I have to have, I have to attach a little bit. That is true. It is impossible to live without attachments. So what you then do, instead of just giving it all up, you start practicing the spiritual path because that reduces those attachments. It gives you has a cushioning effect on you. And then when eventually it comes to the crunch, you're able to deal with these things better. Ideally, of course, you have to give it up completely. Because unless you give it up completely, you're going to redo the same mistake in your next life. This is kind of the issue. It just goes on and on and on. We've made this mistake so many times, and we still haven't learned. This is kind of the problem. If we had learned, we wouldn't be here anymore. So that's the issue. So, okay, what is liable? Maybe, actually, it's 11 o'clock. Should I stop now, Eiling, or should I carry on a little bit? Up to me. Okay. A little bit more then. 10 minutes more. Okay, 10 minutes. Got to 1:15, so we have a full hour maybe, something like that. We'll see what happens. What should be described as sorrow? Partners and children, as libeled sorrow, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle are liable to sorrow. So this is again the problem of life, that life inherently, an inherent part of life is grief and sadness. It's impossible to have a life without any kind of grief and sadness. Why? Well, because our attachments are always challenged. There's always going to be grief in this life. And recently there was a young man, he's actually from Singapore, and he came to me and he said, I want to become a monk, but I have all this grief. Someone in my family died. Is it good to become a monk when you have all this grief? And I said, well, this is a kind of thing which lead people to become monks, or nuns. It's precisely the motivating factor. So that certainly shouldn't stop you, because now you are experiencing the reality of human existence. So again, this is unavoidable. You have to have grief and sorrow in this life. It is part of life. And every life tends to end in grief and sorrow. The end point is always problematic. And that destroys kind of all the happiness in between, because actually it's going to end in sorrow one way or another. It's kind of terrible to be a Buddhist, isn't it? You have to face reality in this way. It's too real. Buddhism is too real. It says, no, I don't want to hear about it. And I sometimes you upset people by being too real, because people don't want to hear reality. I got a question especially when people, sometimes face to face, people don't dare to ask you the questions that they really want to ask. But when they write it, you can feel they get a bit annoyed with you because it's too real. And you feel that the question is coming not from the right place. There's a bit of kind of irritation there with the way you're teaching or whatever. And that's good. It's good because it means that something is hitting you. If someone gets annoyed, someone feels the teaching is challenging, good. Because any spiritual teaching worthy of anything should be challenging. If it isn't challenging, it has no value. So if you feel challenged sometimes by the Buddhist teachings, that's exactly the way it should be. And then you just reflect on it. You don't kind of just take it on board and blindly adhere to these teachings, but you reflect on it and you see if it is true, even though it is challenging. That is and these teachings are really challenging. Life-affirming Buddhist teachings are not real Buddhist teachings, just so you know it. All right. So that is sorrow. Interesting here how it says even the animals are subject to sorrow, right? That's kind of a very important point. And this is a reminder that the way animals are viewed in the suttas, they are viewed much like human beings. They are like simpler versions of us, or whatever you want to call it. But they are like us. They have emotions. Yeah, they're not different from us. They have minds. They experience the world. They are subject to sorrow, grief, depression, probably happiness and joy and all of these kind of things. Can an animal be reborn into heaven because of the happiness and joy? Of course they can. There's an interesting story. This is from the 𝑃𝑟𝑎𝑐𝑡 forest, and this is where maybe we get to this now, I'm not sure. Anyway, there's a story of the 𝑃𝑟𝑎𝑐𝑡 forest where the Buddha goes and he's looked after. The elephant is his upatak, an attendant. You know that story? The Buddha is fed up with the monks are just arguing, the Buddha can't sort it out, so he goes off into the forest, and the elephant comes and looks after him. And there are different versions of that story, but one version is also a monkey here. And this monkey offers some honey to the Buddha. Yeah, and then when the Buddha kind of takes some of the food offered to him, the honey offered him, the monkey is so happy here that he loses the grip on the branch he's holding onto. He's so excited. Yeah, yay. He falls to the ground. He dies and gets reborn straight in heaven here. That's a nice story, isn't it? So this is the happy monkey, the happy kind of bang up to heavenly realm straight away. But the idea is that so these attachments are liable to sorrow. Someone who is tied, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to sorrow, seeks what is also liable to sorrow. And what should be described as liable to corruption? I was going to say politicians, but no, I shouldn't say that. That is not what comes next. Anyway, partners and children, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle, gold and money are liable to corruption. So, liable to corruption, so what does this actually mean? And of course what it means here with gold and money, it is quite obvious. If you have gold where there is kind of mixed in too much other metals, so it isn't pure gold, and it is corrupted, or money that may be fake money, someone has kind of printed money that is dodgy. These things are liable to corruption in the sense that they can often be fake. They're not the real thing. They're corrupted by defilements, if you like. Defilements of gold can also just be dust and these kind of things that stops the gold from shining properly. This is also another way of thinking about corruption of these things. And so when something is corrupted in this way, with this gold and money, it loses its value. Right? It doesn't have any value anymore. This is kind of the point of corruption. So corruption is a bad thing. The things that you normally regard as valuable, that is gone when things get corrupted. And you can see here, this is the first time gold and money is mentioned. Previously it stopped with cattle and elephants. Now gold and money, because the gold and money are corrupted, but gold and money are not really subject to birth, old age and death. Maybe metaphorically, but certainly not in the real sense of the word. And what that means is that the words for old age, birth, illness and death in the suttas, they are to be understood literally. They're not to be understood metaphorically. So when you see dependent origination, it says rebirth and old age and death. It's not metaphorical rebirth, old age and death. It is the real deal. It is actually what happens to beings. These words are used in the literal sense in the suttas, not in the metaphorical sense. If it is used metaphorically, it's extremely, extremely rare. So this is an important point here. So gold and money are liable to corruption. So what about all these other beings, partners and children, servants, animals, all these things? well, they are also liable to corruption in the sense that the person you get married to, the children that you have, the workers in your family, even the animals, they will change over time. Yeah, you know what it's like when you first get married or first kind of get a new girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. Everything is so wonderful, and then things become more ordinary, and eventually you might get divorced. Yeah, that is kind of liable to corruption because first of all, the person themselves are liable to change because we're not solid. But maybe even more important, our perception of that person is changing all the time because perceptions are inherently unreliable. And this is one of the kind of the underlying things with this whole chapter we're looking at now, is that how we perceive the world, how we look at the world, is very different from the way the world actually is. We live in a kind of make-believe world of our own, which has nothing to do with reality. We see only one side of things. We see the happy side of things because our mind is always searching for the happy side of things because we are biased by our defilements. And because we are biased, we only see one side of reality. In the same way, we only see one side of partners, children, workers, animals, and after a while the other side starts to come out and we start to see the reality here. And once you understand that people, animals, everyone is inherently corruptible in this way, it makes it far less interesting here, because things are not what you believe they are. Things are actually quite different under the surface. So what kind of corruption am I talking about? Well, you know, sometimes people are really nice in the beginning, but then you realize they have other aspects of the personality. Maybe they have anger going on there. And if someone is angry or angry quite a lot, it is very difficult to have that sort of person very close to you. It's painful to be living with someone who is angry, especially if they're angry a lot. Yeah, or they have other defilements like desires, that eventually they don't desire you anymore and they do something else. All of these things are inherently corruptible aspect of beings. Also animals are the same thing. Yeah, animals may love you and then they may hate you. And these things change down the track. So it's another nice way of thinking about beings, this inherent corruptibility of beings. These attachments are liable to corruption. Someone who is tired, infatuated, and attached to such things, themselves liable to corruption, seeks what is also liable to corruption. This is the ignoble search. All right, so I'm going to stop there because now we have looked at the ignoble search. The next one is the noble search. So we can start with that afresh. In the meantime, I ask you please have a nice lunch together and do a bit more meditation if you like. And we'll see you back again. What is it? What time do we start?